What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of the Medicopolis podcast, where two teenagers discuss medical dilemmas and police them to reach an ultimatum on whether the situation is ethical or not. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen, and we hope you enjoy our episode on the ethics of human experimentation. So human research has been used for quite a while in our history to make scientific gains. And it has been used in a positive way and it has been used in a negative way. So Ashwin and I are going to talk a lot about how it's been used mostly in a negative way, since this is an ethics podcast. And we're going to talk about the different guidelines, different population groups vulnerable to abuse in human experimentation, the origins of human experimentation guidelines, and cases of unethical human experimentation.
Human experimentation has been around since, the dawn of times, basically. You know what I'm talking about. People use human experimentation all the time just to, prove something is right or wrong with modern medicine. Even, back in earlier centuries when modern medicine was just starting out, human experimentation was popular. So it's to see how guidelines have evolved over the ages is something that's pretty interesting to me. I guess, what do you think was the most interesting part?
Personally, I think that human experimentation, how it's been used to make scientific breakthroughs, and for example, most recently, I know human experimentation aided with the coronavirus, being used to help solve epidemics, pandemics, and threats to our world today. That's what I find most fascinating about human experimentation.
Okay, I mean that's interesting because I like to know that it was evolved from some place. You just like the fact that the applications, which I can respect both. There's a lot definitely surrounding the guidelines to start with. For example, the Belmont Report was broader and established three basic ethical principles, which were respect for the persons, or I guess the people in your experiment, beneficence, and justice. So essentially, phrasing guidelines around those, I thought was pretty interesting. When talking about the concept of human experimentation, you have to consider that it's very broad. Because obviously a lot of medicine is used in ways besides specific outcomes of human experimentation. So you might have to use separate types of human experimentation or teeter on the guidelines. I thought that was kind of cool.
I think beneficence is the coolest principle, or well, not coolest, but I think it's, in my opinion, the most important principle. But because I think it's all about respecting people's decisions and protecting them from harm at the same time. And I think that's really what medicine comes down to.
But if you think it's respect, why don't you just choose the first principle, respect for persons?
I mean, they all overlap. So I guess you could say, they all overlap in certain way. Respect for persons is respecting their decisions, but beneficence is kind of both respecting their decisions, protecting them from harm, and also making active efforts to secure their well-being. And so I think beneficence kind of overarches respect for persons.
Okay, so you think it's just more of a broad guideline, basically?
Yeah, and therefore I think it's better.
I just like the idea of justice because in those unethical human cases, which we will get to by the way, because in those unethical human cases you see a lot of justice being delivered to the people that were in the experiment, and also seeing the experimenter I sort of get shut down in their research. I think that's just pretty interesting because it's the penance, and the penance in my mind just seems more there's a lot more drive in penance versus raw research.
Yeah, and I also think part of justice is making sure that, for example, economically disadvantaged people, racially disadvantaged people, they get the positive benefits from whatever research occurs in human experimentation. And I think that the justice makes it at least brings us closer to an even level playing field where all of us have good access to healthcare. I know that might be a controversial topic.
I think also a lot of part of it too is that when you do experiments on certain groups of people, there's sometimes a lot of a factor that isn't included where testers, or not testers, the people in the experiments, I guess the subjects, don't get a lot of the compensation that they deserve for the type of experiment that is happening. So I just feel like there's a back and forth there with justice that has this sort of two-face, which I think is pretty complex for just an ethical principle.
Yeah, and I think there's no like right answer for this justice
Well,
component because there's
yeah,
always going to be like two sides to the story.
yeah,
So,
obviously. It just depends on which side you see first, rather. I mean, we're talking about what is like the most interesting. So I mean, there's not like there needs to be a right answer anyway. It's just like what we thought. So I thought that was pretty cool anyway.
yeah. Justice has the most wiggle room. So, I actually changed my mind because justice does have like the most wiggle room and it has like a lot more interpretation on how you think of it rather than beneficence and respect for persons are at least a little bit more straightforward.
And they're very like transparent. Like you kind of said, there's just one side.
Well, not always, but yeah, for the most part, there's usually
Yeah,
one
yeah.
side because sometimes it may be hard to respect people's decisions and protect them from harm at the same time, for example. And that's where kind of the idea of beneficence might come into play, where there might be debates about how to handle the situation.
And obviously, the ethical principles can form ethical guidelines. So, for example, the NIH, which is the National Institute of Health, actually has their own list of ethical guidelines when considering human experimentation. And I thought that reading through these um, showed a lot of like new points that I hadn't thought about previously. So, for example, the favorable risk-benefit ratio, which kind of seems obvious, but to me at the time, it wasn't like something that immediately caught my eye. Basically, saying that if the risks can be like physical or physiological, economic or social or whatever, the end result of the experiment should be enough to pay off the risk that the person took. I thought it was just like decently interesting because it shows a lot of the biggest problem with human experimentation, like where it draws unethical lines, to where people aren't getting the benefit of the risk that they took, especially if it was like a huge physical risk.
Yeah, that sounds like a good like way to draw the line of where risk happens and how to how to see if the human experiment is worth ending up pursuing or not.
And I think a lot of it too is that with these experiments, when facing different communities, that you have to be careful that the risk benefit can be the same between each community that you take samples from. So essentially, if you were to take someone from like a higher socioeconomic status and use some of that wealth, you have to be sure that someone from a lower socioeconomic status can use the same wealth and still have a like the benefit that equally weighs in with what the person with the higher socioeconomic status has. So it's just like sort of a fine line there that you have to be careful of. At
Yeah,
least what I
because
think.
there's been so many times where people with higher socioeconomic status have been prioritized over those with socioeconomic disadvantages. And one example that I want to talk about is a study about treatment of syphilis for African Americans. And 600 African American men, 399 who had syphilis, basically became participants, and they were given free medical exams, free meals, and burial insurance for their participation. But they were not informed that the study aimed to document the progression of syphilis without treatment. And so basically, these African American men were thrown into an experiment with factors that were important not being given to them. And this caused a lot of controversy, and rightfully so, because these economically and socially disadvantaged people were being taken advantage of by the U.S. Public Health Service, which is supposed to be reliable. So I just kind of wanted to talk about that a little bit. Sorry if I got on a tangent.
No, I think this is also a really important case because it shows the a violation of one of the other guidelines that the NIH or the National Institute for Health states is that scientific validity, which is that a study should be designed in a way that will get an understandable answer to the important research question. Essentially, during this experiment, a lot was not found through the progression of syphilis because of technology at the time. So even though these people were literally exploited for this disease that they had, they it was never offered. And again, they didn't find many repeating stages of the increase of syphilis. So it was important to note that it didn't it didn't outweigh the risk that they took, and two, it didn't show anything. So it was just a complete unethical like breach, which I thought was pretty like disgusting almost to see people use other people to just let them die. It's like, why would you do that? You have nothing to gain from it. Because I mean, these people at the time might have thought that they had gotten some proper result out of it, but if they don't have any result out of it, there's no point. I think that's like a big takeaway from a lot of the experiments that go on with like misuse of a human. It's just that when you deal with problems where there isn't a result found, you have to also accept the consequences that a risk was taken and a benefit needs to be provided. And there are other cases like this syphilis case that have happened over history. It's not just this one, where a lot of times an experiment will be done on a group of people, but then the experiment doesn't have any turnover, and the patients end up being harmed in the end. One example of this was from 1913 to 1951, where Leo Stanley, a chief surgeon at San Quentin State Prison, had performed vasectomies on prisoners who he then recruited through promises of improved health and vigor, but he believed that the effects of aging and decreased hormones contributed to criminality, weak morality, and poor physical attributes, so he began transplanting the testicles of younger men into those who were older, who had restored the masculinity. But then he ran out of testicles to use, so he ended up using animals. Not a good idea. But at the time, he was trying to do research. Obviously, it didn't have a lot of benefits, and obviously, it didn't end up to a lot of happiness from his patients. So he was shut down from his research, and he had done an estimated 10,000 testicular procedures. So who knows how many people were affected by this?
Yeah, I mean that sounds really bad. I mean, like what? Like 10,000 people are going to be affected by this not even mistake cuz he did it knowingly, but this disaster in which he used the testicles of animals in order to make scientific progress without really without showing or proving that it would be safe. That falls under the ethical guidelines for human research in the Belmont Report, that it needs to not do harm like unnecessarily, the research.
And I'm pretty sure that this is harm, if I had to guess.
Well, yeah. No question about it. I mean, yeah, and I'm also curious as to what happened to Leo Stanley. Ashwin, what do you think the consequences should be for doing this on, again, 10,000 procedures? 10,000
Well,
procedures.
so for animal experimentation, a lot of what happens is basically dumbed down to being revoked your license to research. But obviously, this is a little different, and it comes with a few more consequences. So what I'm pretty sure happened was a sentence, just a prison. It makes more sense. Because what he did was not just violate science and ethical research guidelines, but also basic human rights.
Yeah.
So
I'd I'd say about 20 to 40 years would be okay, cuz 10,000 for the quantity, 10,000 experiments, and for not following the ethical guideline, breaking the ethical guideline.
yeah, so I think it's definitely important to draw that boundary there and be able to identify that this dude was not doing the right thing. Not at all.
Exactly.
And that was our 13th episode, so thank you guys so much for listening to the Medicopolis podcast. We hope you all stay tuned for next week's episode, and as well as what is to come in the future.